just to say a little bit about the structure of how the course will be organised. Every week I'll be handing things out in this very old-fashioned way. So you'll be getting bits of paper. And what I hope is that these bits of paper accumulate and not just in the bottom of your bag. They accumulate and build an archive. Because what I'll be handing out are lots of key quotes. So this archive, and we're going to study archives, and there'll be a session specifically on what might constitute an archive of everyday life, what might constitute an archive of ordinariness. All of the quotes will begin to build an account of the relationship between art and the ordinary. And the other thing that I hope is this will become a really important document. You can glance at them, you can forget that I'm talking and reading or whatever during the session. But I want to start with a set of words that seem to define the everyday. I'm going to read them out. The ordinary, the unnoticed, the habitual, the routine, the mundane, the monotonous, the trivial, the uncatalogued, the boring, the tedious, the uneventful, the humdrum, the commonplace, the unnoteworthy, the drab, the dreary, the banal, the dull, the residual. And I also want to say something about the form there, which is obviously it's a list. And one of the things you'll begin to notice is that the list is one of the key formal ways of registering the ordinary. We'll come back to lots of writers or artists, thinkers, who return to the idea of list making. And list making maybe just as a way of noting down characteristics, or trying to get hold of ambiguity or complication. But also the list as a form of poetry.
What is surrealist, like the surrealist manifesto he wrote, and like the old 30s edition of it. And I was just wondering, like, because he's talking a lot about how kind of like surrealism is trying to challenge the everyday in a way which becomes where like you're making like connections to objects, to other things. So it's as well like, so like how like, I'm forgetting the piece of work, how like certain like with bananas there's a painting where like bananas are one of the main focal points, and it means like about trade and so on, and it means about like empires and so on, and how like certain objects in certain like contexts mean certain things. And I think that's what they were trying to talk about.
So Bresson,
yeah,
pretty well the person who developed, organised the surrealists. Now the problem with Bresson is basically he wanted to form a gang, and he was the person who said he was in the gang and he wasn't. But he's a really important figure in 20th century art, and now we see in 20th century sociology, anthropology and philosophy, because he developed the idea that the ordinary was actually the extraordinary. And so surrealism, and before it Dalí, were two of the key 20th century art movements that were interested in the very, very ordinary, precisely because you can make it strange. So the idea of making strange is something we'll come back to quite a lot. It was a really important idea in Dada and surrealism. It was a really important idea in Russian formalism and constructivism around the period of the surface of things. So there's a really, in one of the pieces I suggested you read for the session, there's a moment when he talks about intuition, about being able to intuit which is going to be the fastest moving checkout at a supermarket, Or when driving, who's the person that veers all over the place or will change lanes in a way you can't predict. And one of the things she's interested in is how we can, in some way, intuit the flows. We can get just under the surface of it, so we begin to move with the flow rather than it move through us. So she's trying to write is engaged in, that also may be very, very different, but that there are certain things that hold us. And technology is one of those things.
But then, not like that, like what are we kind of examining? Do you know what I mean? Like, what are we looking at? I'm just looking at sort of, I guess, you know, just learning to be able to notice that, to see it, to sort of question it or whatever. Because I don't see, like you were saying, like, I was thinking, like, is there an alternative to this? But there is, like, you know, it's life, isn't it, really? Can't really kind of...
In a sense, yes, that's the conundrum. And it's the same conundrum that is at the centre of most philosophical thinking. And I think most... Oh, that's pretty good. I saw one for 200.
Do you have any spare?
Sorry?
Do you have any spare?
I do not have any spare. In fact, I only have my own copy is printed upside down. I gave away all of the proper copies I had, and the only one I kept, you had to open it up and turn it around because it's upside down and back to front. But there it is on, and now this is something else. I'll be sending you some links to books which are on memory of the world. Do you know Memory of the World? It's an archive of published books. And it is run partly, it's funded by UNESCO, so it's legitimate, but it has a PDF of hundreds of thousands of books. And it's a really useful place to look if you can't find something in the library. And you can download your own copy to have on your computer. I think they do now, yeah. I haven't checked. I know that someone put mine up, so I know that. But Memory of the World is a really, really good resource. When I was talking earlier about the pandemic, it was one of the ways we were able to get information to students in China, for instance, because it wasn't prescribed as a website. So I could send a message to someone to get a book, and obviously we couldn't find it on the library, but it was up on Memory of the World. And so it was a way of ensuring during the pandemic, when everybody was scattered across the world, that everybody had a kind of central library. And you can simply just download books. There are a couple of other sites actually. Monoscope is very good. MONOSKOP. Now that's specifically about art, performance, dance, film. And it's a brilliant resource of book lists, of historical articles, things on any artist you might mention. So Monoscope is very good. And UbuWeb. Do you know UbuWeb? It's UBUWEB. And UbuWeb is a repository and archive of poetry, anthropology and art. But the great thing about UbuWeb is it's the one place you can see avant-garde cinema. So it has a fantastic list of films under artists' names that you can access and watch, things that you can't see otherwise.
So how did you spell that again?
Ubu, UBUWEB, UbuWeb. And it's if you're looking for 1960s feminist performance films, the one place you might find it is on UbuWeb. If you want to find Warhol, if you want to find Fluxus film, it's all up on UbuWeb. And lots of artists have allowed their work to go up on it because it's become this international repository. There's a lot of contemporary work up on it as well. So it's a really good resource. Have you got it up? You found it?
Oh, no.
It's one of the things that is a new form of learning. in a lecture, when you're lecturing, you say something, and everybody types it into their phone. And it's a really strange kind of experience. There's that kind of immediacy. So those are three really useful books which are about ideas and art to do with the everyday. Every week I'll be giving you more things that you might read, and I'll be suggesting novels, collections of poetry. And I would say if you're going to read one novel about the ordinary, this is the one to read. Annie Ernaux, The Years. And actually she won the Nobel Prize for Literature just recently. And this is a really fantastic piece of writing about growing up as a young girl in France immediately after the Second World War, then becoming someone who wanted to move out of a farming community and go to the big city, to go to Paris, to live a contemporary life. And the early parts of this are really interesting because they're about how her family life was completely dominated by the seasons, by farming. They didn't have any of the kind of commodities that you might imagine, washing machines, televisions, a car, any of those things. And then suddenly, a family started to acquire these things. And all of the early parts of the book are about that transformation, but written from the present, looking back. And feeling both a kind of nostalgia for that moment, and at the same time recognising where the only thing she wanted to do was leave, was get out of that kind of community, to find another life in the city, and also as a young woman, to get an education. And it's a really interesting book because she finds a form to try and write about this kind of dual aspect of trying to remember the past while talking about the present.
There's a similar book called Toast. There's a similar book called Toast, which is
Toast.
a man's reflections on growing up with foods he was raised eating.
Oh, I don't know that.
It's really quite fun.
You have to.
Jack, isn't that Nigel Slater's autobiography? Yeah, I think it's, yeah, like, it's his autobiography, I think.
This
like,
is kind of her autobiography, so you don't know whether the things in it are actually true. So it's fiction. And this is what I mean about when I said earlier about the mixing up of genres, the mixing up of disciplines. One of the things in a lot of the writing I'll be suggesting is it's both true and not true. It's both directly born of experience and to do with maybe fantasy. It mixes up those kind of generic distinctions that have been so important to our understanding of literature. I'm going to mention this in a minute, the idea of a diary and what are the conventions of a diary. But Ernaux uses a kind of, it's like a constraint or a strategy where she starts a section of the book from a photograph. And she's talking in the third person. This young girl wanted to do this young girl wanted to do that. So she finds a structure that allows her to move back and forth between remembering things, experiencing things, and fictionalizing things. It's a really interesting experiment in writing. And we'll see that in a lot of the books that aren't academic books that I recommend. So pretty well every week I'll be recommending possible novels that we look at. But this, they sell in the Word bookshop on the corner. It's Fitzcarraldo. They're based in Deptford, so it's a local publisher. And there are lots of her books have been translated in the last couple of years. A couple of them are very harrowing, about her life in Paris, and they're quite difficult reading. By curating students at the Court Institute. So just over Waterloo Bridge on the right, you've got the Court, fabulous gallery of mainly painting. And the Courton is also one of the oldest established art historical institutions in the UK. And they run a program like we do in the art department for curating students, mainly at postgraduate level. And their exhibition, which was 2019 they were organising in 2019, so it's going to start in 2020, I think, was called Unquiet Moments, Capturing the Everyday. And I'd seen that this was coming up, planned to go to it with this group of students. We were going to make connection with the students there, they were going to do a session in the gallery, and it looked like it could be a really interesting connection for undergraduate art students to meet with postgraduate curation students. Then, just as it was about to open, the pandemic hit. And they tried to take the exhibition online. Of course, it becomes a completely different experience. And they started to reflect on the differences, on what it meant for something which was about noticing the everyday to be transformed by a fundamental change in the everyday. And there have been a number of people writing recently about what happened in that moment. And there were really simple things that suddenly changed. So one is obviously that we were all locked into our homes. And I didn't see my son for about 3 months. We shouted to each other from my balcony. He came out on the street. But he'd just come back from Bangkok. He got one of the last flights back, which was terrifying because suddenly you realised that if you were in one place and the lockdown happened, that was it. You were going to stay in that place. There was going to be no transportation. So the kind of expectation that you could travel was just withdrawn completely across the whole world. But also, so that's a really major thing that happens on a macro level. But then I remember getting on a bus, and everybody on the bus didn't want to touch any surface. So everybody was standing there, and buses were really, kind of going back and forth, nobody going like this, and nobody wanted to hold on to any of the handrails. Because at that moment, we've been told the way you're going to get this is through contamination of touch. And so suddenly everybody was carrying a gel to clean your hands after doing something as simple as getting on a bus and holding the handrail. And then people were told that they were going to have to wash everything that came into their homes. So suddenly there was a fundamental transformation in the most ordinary of things. Getting the bus home after work, going shopping, bringing things back, and taking things out of a shopping bag and putting them in a fridge. And the pandemic becomes a really interesting way of thinking about just how much goes without saying in the way that we live in the world. That at that moment, in March 2020, suddenly got thrown up in the air completely. And all of those really ordinary things became troublesome, worrying, things that you couldn't take for granted. And then really major things like trying to travel to get home from another part of the world. That also became impossible. So there was something really interesting about this exhibition called Unquiet Moments, capturing the everyday, happening at exactly the same time that there was fundamental transformation in the ordinary and everyday. And the students recognised it immediately. they started to talk about how odd it was to try and curate an exhibition online. Now, this is tiny, so I'll read this out. But this is how they organised their exhibition. And as I say, I will be putting these slides up on VLE so you can see this on your phone or tablet or computer. But they organised the works that they were going to show into three fundamental categories. One was visual diaries. Second was family albums and community portraits. And the third was traces of loss. And they were looking for works that were in the Arts Council collection, the UK Arts Council collection, but they thought they could slot into these different categories because they'd read an awful lot of the material on the everyday, and they thought these were three categories that were going to be useful for bringing.
Substantial, like it's a history book of your own life, maybe.
I was going to say that there's that art piece where the artist destroyed every single earthly object. Michael Landy's piece, and like he was, and how when he destroyed everything, the only thing he said he missed the most was his dad's like leather jacket, and it's like he destroyed passports, he destroyed music, he destroyed like family photo albums. He destroyed his diaries, he destroyed his all his tax papers, he destroyed death certificates from his family and so on. And I think what's really interesting is that he eventually missed, the only thing he missed was his dad's coat. And I think
that might be precisely what you're talking about, a kind of romanticism.
Yeah.
In a way, I guess maybe a little bit like, not to be pessimistic, but maybe a bit self-important in a way, or maybe it's like just a means of like, documenting or passing the time. Maybe you said like maybe is a kind of, like dear diary, like today is
I saw
kind of
it.
like,
Oh, did you?
Yeah, and it was in an old big shop on Oxford Street.
Yeah.
I kind of thought of my it was between, being a sports direct and
that all conveyor belts and that.
and he turned it into a ritual. So you actually went in and watched things being destroyed, and he destroyed quite a lot of artwork, which caused some consternation. Destroyed a piece by Sarah Lucas.
His diary is like one of the most important historical documents for transmasculine people. Like along with stuff like Stone Butch Blues by Leslie Feinberg, which was semi-autobiographical about their life as a Jewish transgender lesbian in the 60s. And while it is like inherently an unreliable narrator, it kind of, because of that, it evades all the kind of superstructures of wider society and more formalized versions of history, and I think that's kind of, it's existing in the crevices between all of that, which is what the ordinary is.
We'll be looking at some of that material a bit when we do the archive session. One of the key books will be Anne Chekovich's An Archive of Feelings, which is, and she looks at things like mixtapes and the ephemera of going to a gig and keeping that kind of material as a way of constructing a personal archive of connections and transformation. So, and that has prompted a number of exhibitions which are about precisely that kind of minor material. So the way that someone might make up a mixtape for someone they care about, or they love, or they pass that on, and that becomes another form of archive. But it's a counter archive, precisely as you say, it falls in the gaps of official archives.
I think what's quite interesting is as well how ever since the invention of photography, how that's slowly changed as well. I think probably how photography has allowed us to see access to so much more than what we would have usually been able to access. And I think that we can as well put ourselves into positions from viewing photography in a
Hold
way.
that thought, because that is a perfect introduction to something I'm going to show in about 3 or 4 minutes. So don't forget that, hold on to it. Because I do want to show you some artworks. So in the kind of diaristic part of this exhibition, but also could go into the family album. So another category was about family albums, which are Afran's photographs of the very minor and ordinary. Is they take a lot of effort. Take a lot of effort to make and a lot of effort to print. And also, he tried to set this up so he took them from exactly the same place every day. So he had to mark out a space on the kitchen floor, that meant that he was going to put the tripod in the same space. Had to be on a tripod. So there's something about the relationship between the work that is going into a photograph like this and the apparent content of the photograph, which opens up some kind of space between the two things. Firstly, and then
I was going to say, with these images, kind of, you almost get a sense of kind of like digital synesthesia. I don't know why, like for me, like,
no idea what that is.
well, like kind of like the feeling of like knowing that like kind of like colours and like certain things and smells like from like imagery, or like as well like listening to stuff, like seeing an image and hearing the
Did you say
image,
digital sense?
or digital in the sense that I'm being able to view it like without it being presently there. And the idea that basically like kind of like with these images, like you can smell probably the sink, kind of the bleach coming, and like as well handling these images is in a way kind of like I can kind of hear them and so on a lot of the time. And I feel with these images, like when I saw the teapot, I can hear the sound of the kettle hiss, kind of I can smell the smell of the tea being made, right, and so on. And there's a lot of like active movement to these like photographs. And I think what's interesting is as well, by using like large format photography, is it freezes those moments for so long because of the exposure rate, that eventually it becomes something where those images become crowded in your head, kind of, because everyone experiences them in some way.
It's a paradox that I'm showing you these from a stick that I made at home, having downloaded these images from Nigel Shefflin's website, and they are large format hand printed photographs. So what ideally, of course, what I do is bring the photograph into the room, and we can then look at it and talk about it. But given circumstances, I can't do that. But there is something here that opens up between the way that they're made and the form they take in exhibition, and what I'm doing now, showing them to you. And then,
with the effort put into taking a photograph, do you think it actually abstracts, makes it more offensive as records?
I'm not sure. I work with analog technology. I make 16mm films using a clockwork camera. So I would say, of course, they're brilliant because of they engage with a slow, methodical process, and you can't see anything until you get it processed. And so I shoot something, it goes off to the processors, and 2 weeks later I get it back. Then I can look at it and know what I've shot, which is why I keep a notebook. Because the notebook is a form of memory, so I'm reminded of what I've shot. So the person I work with, we draw everything we shoot as a form of mnemonic. So that's a different kind of diary. But at the same time, we do allow our films to be shown sometimes digitally, although we try to get them printed to film and show them from a projector in a space with a rackety old projector and a pull-up screen. But now that's getting so difficult to do, to make film in that way. To make the negative into something that can be used for printing, we're now having to go to Massachusetts to work with someone to get that done, and then we had to go to Amsterdam to get them printed. There is no one in the UK that can construct an A and B roll negative at the moment. It's like we're working in a form that is disappearing before our eyes because everybody's retiring. And there aren't that many young people coming through who are working in the same form. So it's being made redundant, that form. But Shafran is someone who takes photographs using this meticulous process. And you really have to know what you're doing. You know, setting the exposure is a really complex process with this. If you've tried it, it takes a long time. So there's something about the meticulousness of this as a process that Shafran thinks is important to learn.
It's funny that he's like gone, like, do you know what I mean? Instead of doing the dishes, I suppose there's that angle to look at it as well. You know what I mean? If you're going on about how long he's taking to calibrate the camera or whatever, to do the dishes.
Yeah,
You know?
because doing the washing up, I do the washing up twice a day, and I quite enjoy it in a way. It's like a moment out of time. It's like a little ritual. Put some music on, wash up. But yes, it's something you don't really think about, unless of course you're someone forced to do the washing up. Because you're in a relationship, or there are conventions that say you are the person who does the washing up. In which case, then it becomes a certain type of domestic labour. But there's something interesting about it. It probably takes Shafran more time to set up the camera and take the photograph than it does to do the washing up. There's something about what is it we're looking at. I think you're right, it's a moment in time.
Well, as well, I was going to say, but it's quite archival in some ways, in the sense that basically, like, we're looking at it from being
emergence of absurdity in these absurd moments where, like, you know, you come up with these absurd systems to make life logistically viable, like, and that's constantly changing as technology changes.
What would be the difference between taking this photograph and doing a drawing or a painting? Because of course, one of the great traditions of Western easel painting has been the still life.
Yeah. I mean, I think a painting, like, if I did my dishes and then decided to set up an easel in my kitchen and, you know, do a painting of it, that would be equally as logistically absurd. Because, like, my flatmates would be buzzing around me, like, I'd be painting, I'd be constantly in fear of getting paint everywhere because then I'm going to lose my deposit. We're not allowed to oil paint in the house. So, like, then there's a whole new level. So it's kind of the logistical absurdity, and then you get into kind of how capitalism works and the fact that, you know, part of, you know, the logistical absurdity that probably most of us is putting up with is just like the renting system, you know, like, you know, and that's part of the everyday. I mean, I live
Isn't that kind of coming back to why making art might be an interesting way of trying to deal with it?
Yeah, it's kind of a push and pull of that, like trying to figure out the absurdity of it.
It could be pointless, or it could be futile. There's like no real demand for him to do a painting or take a picture of whatever this might be, and then draw attention to the, I guess, labour efforts or time it takes to wash up, or how long it takes for him to set up the camera. Also, you know, but I guess that's just kind of the point of this maybe.
But as pointless as the Zubaran in the 16th, 17th century of a teacup and an orange and some utensils. I mean, that has been one of the fundamental traditions in the Western Victorian tradition.
And I find anything that's still alive, like, how long is it pointless? Because, like, my work is mainly still life. I'm a still life painter, I'm still like fanatic. I have been for over 5 years, and it's like it takes on media, it takes on a life of its own. You know, it's only pointless for as long as you make it pointless.
I wasn't going to say that, like, it's definitely pointless, but, like, you know, there's something that compels you or Nigel Shafran or whatever to just do this and draw attention to whatever it is that he might be drawing attention to, or you might be drawing attention to, or something like that. I think it's more just what we were saying, the kind of pointlessness of it is like, he doesn't need to do that. So you don't need to do that in the way that, you know, I guess, what's it doing? Not to put you down specifically or anything like that, but like, you know, the same question kind of I would apply to sort of anyone here, when you're making work.
I mean, one of the interesting things about that tradition, a form of recording things, a form of memory, but also a way of, you know, like Moran painting the same few objects for 50 years, returning every day to the same, probably less than 20 objects in his studio, and painting them religiously, and I use just a second, literally painting them religiously, over and over again. And they are some of the most beautiful, extraordinary, captivating paintings you'll ever see.
Is it the capture of aesthetics then? Because then the capture,
It is
like,
aesthetic.
because it's then like in some ways then all we're talking about is how design and aesthetic eventually change, and I think that's what's
Oh, I
quite,
see.
and I think that's what's quite
No,
interesting.
it's not that.
But like that's like maybe why still life, in, like through medium and so on, such as painting and so on. So like I don't know, like when you look at like maybe like Bauhaus.
Hang on, now don't introduce that.
Don't try to
Go on, what were you going to say before I show you some different images?
I don't know, like, still life has never really been about aesthetics for me. There's like this sentimentality, it's like this psychogeography of the subculture of my individual existence. You know, it is, they take on a life of themselves, they are an extension of me, you know. They become a myth of itself. It's kind of this, you know, and I don't know, I think pretending the ordinary isn't this like kind of, it can't take on this mythological kind of energy absorbing life of its own, kind of discounts so much art about the ordinary. I mean, and so much like particularly subcultural history of the ordinary. If you look at Philip Guston's still life paintings, there are these absurd mythological things of like his life, and you know, it's kind of technicolor, and then you.
But has anybody said that still life isn't mythological?
I don't know, there was a lot of talk of it being inherently aesthetic, and I'm not sure.
Well, the mythological is the aesthetic. They're
I'm
the
not
two
sure it
things
is.
that are absolutely fundamentally aligned, I would say. Mythology is an aesthetic way of understanding culture. It's a way of turning events and experiences, structures, into fictional ideas that often anthropomorphize an idea so it becomes articulated through a body, an animal or a human or something. I would say that there's something going on in this, which is precisely what we're talking about. I don't think that there has to be an opposition
They're not
between
mutually exclusive.
no, the aesthetic and the mythological, I would say, are very, very linked. But let me show a couple more slides. Good discussion, really interesting discussion. Because here we move from objects to people in very particular communities. And this is Barbara Walker, who is currently showing in the Turner Prize show at Tower. Anybody been down to see that?
That's where I used to live near.
Oh, no, you saw.
Yeah, I got dragged to the tower multiple times during secondary school.
Well, they've got the Turner Prize show opened 2 weeks ago. And Barbara Walker has a room in which her drawings are being exhibited, massive drawings, drawn directly onto the wall. And these are, again, from her own start of the 2000s, a series of paintings she did in a local community in Birmingham. And there were a whole series of paintings in a barber shop. And through the paintings, the same characters emerge. You start to see them, the barber, regular customers, people who go in for a conversation. and the barbershop becomes the centre of a certain kind of community, of a group. And her drawings and paintings, these are large-scale paintings. I think this one's probably about 8 foot, 8 foot, so they're pretty large scale. And again, you have repetition, the return. She goes back again and again and again. She draws again and again, and then the paintings emerge. And so here, the paintings and the drawings, the watercolours, effectively become a family album of a space, of a community. And so, again, this idea of seriality, of repetition, it's really important that you see a number of these in sequence, that you understand what's going on here in terms of the repetition, of the return, of coming back to something again and again. And that's absolutely at the centre of the show at the town at the moment. You know, she's made very, very large-scale drawings, which are portraits of members of the Windrush generation and on the letters that they've received from the government. So she's done large facsimiles of the letters. These must be kind of 7 or 8 feet by 4 feet, and then large-scale portraits over the top. And it's the accumulation that becomes really important in this work. The sense of coming back to the same thing over and over again, of returning. I'd recommend going down and seeing them. I think her work is really strong. Towner Gallery in Eastbourne. So it's an hour and 20-minute train journey down to the Sussex coast. Okay, we're already running late, so I'm going to try and whiz through a few across the world. So I want you to send me photographs from your albums of the family. But what I'm really interested in are photographs where there's a trace of someone's handwritten message, or there's a trace of the material culture of production. So a lot of them have, you know, things like a little description of who it is, the date. So in a way they're kind of timestamp. But also these kind of what become like a legend or a glossary of signs, you know, an arrow to another photograph that would have been next to it. Or in this case, the photographic studios where they would have been taken and printed. So I think Chandra was interested in the photograph, but also interested in something that is rarely seen, but which locates it. And locates a kind of communicative channel around the photograph that in a way authenticates it, says this is real, this is of this person. And when I look at the photographic album, tying it to a family, tying it to a tradition. And there's some really nice writing about this. There's some very good writing about Barbara Walker as well. If you just go online onto Google, you can find all kinds of reviews of those. But there's some interviews from Amy Chandra about this piece of work and about the way that she was trying to reconstruct a family history, not just from the photographic images, but also from all of these hidden, tiny messages that almost aren't messages.
It feels almost like a geographical.
Yeah, you start to notice handwriting. You start to notice the stamp of a printed, you know, kind of branding for an early photographic studio or someone who would take photographs of families. You know, it doesn't really exist in the same way. And I just wanted to mention Teju Cole's Garden Apple and Sun. Teju Cole has just released a novel, or just had a novel published this week in reviews in all the newspapers. And this was a pandemic project that was published about a year and a half ago, 2 years ago. And again, it's photographs that he took every day at round about the same time from the same position of the after effects of a meal, you know, the utensils, some of the cooking things. In the book, they're all, again, date stamped, time stamped. Taken with a medium format camera. And these form a kind of diary.
I was going to say it's quite interesting how, like, these are as well, how these are now so accessible in some ways, and how, like, when I look at through my phone and go through to my photos, I can check Jane exactly when a photo was taken at exactly what time of day, and I think that's what's quite interesting in is how these kind of almost feel like outside of that, weirdly, as well. They feel kind of like, they feel more personal, even though I've never experienced like this person's life, Jane, and I think that's what's quite interesting in a way, but there's a difference now between what's on here, Jane, and so on my phone, and what's being published in that book. And so on.
Well, yeah, I mean, in a way, if you compare what happens in your phone to the material culture of those little stamps or handwritten things on the photograph, and Chandra was interested in, you can not only date it, but it will tell you where you were.
Yeah.
And I get this really, I presume it's happening on all of your phones, I just haven't turned it off. But every now and then I get something come up on my phone and it says, you have another memory. And then it says Rome. And I think, how the fuck do you know, who's done that? And it's just like an algorithm that looks back and it's
like a whole folder of pictures of me that the phone's picked out from the pictures of me. Or like the ones of my cat, or in the folder that my phone's created, you know.
yeah.
I don't know.
Kind of scary.
Yeah, it's spooky. But there's something about that like categorization that the
Yeah.
computer's doing that's quite interesting, I think.
We do 5 more minutes?
Yeah.
Sure? If you have to go, just say. Alright, just the book is a beautiful production. It's a Mac book, so it's highest quality printing, and the text is on, there are 3 different types of paper in the book. It's a really exquisite thing. And it mixes up a number of things. So you have this record of Teju Cole's meals over about a month through the pandemic. And he talks about how he did that as a way of just trying to hold on to something regular, rhythmic, while he was in New York under lockdown and he couldn't leave his flat. So he talks about the kind of therapeutic importance of taking photographs of something directly in front of him as a way of trying to hold on to the experience. But he also then connected it to another project he was doing, which was on cooking and food and slavery. And the cookbook that he reproduces alongside all the photographs is a cookbook which was written by a cook in a grand house, I think in Boston. And of course the recipes are all being cooked by a cook and written out by someone who would never eat this food. And his narratives try and think about those kinds of historical things that are absolutely central to, say, the history of food and kind of this little salt cod. He traces the history of that as an artifact and the history of salt production, and tries to think about the way that something as simple as the salt on a table or pepper or whatever have these hidden and really difficult histories that you can start to trace back. You can start to think about circulation, the commodity, the movement of commodities, about the emergence of commodities at a certain moment in the history of capitalism. And he writes a narrative alongside this in which he tries to connect up his photographic activity, cookbooks, the history of salt, indenture and slavery.
It feels very inherently anarchist.
In a way, that's interesting because in a lot of this kind of writing, there's an attempt to find a form which is adequate to registering complexity. So one of the things that a lot of this writing tries to do is mix genres, precisely because genres no longer describe the world.
And it's a postmodern writing practice for
So that,
the
yeah.
emergence of postmodernism.
Postmodernism would be the moment when genre and discipline become mixed up. So you can't simply separate out the anthropological from the autobiographical. And this actually goes right back to what we were talking about with surrealism. Some of the first surrealist attempts at anthropology mix up dreams with observation and suggest that you can't separate these two things out into different genres, different disciplines, that everything becomes mixed up. And on that point, we'll finish. We've gone on 15 minutes too long. Okay, thank you very much.